December of 1753, a 21-year-old British officer by the name of George Washington was sent from Williamsburg to the French Fort Le Boeuf near what is now Waterford, Pennsylvania. His mission was to deliver a letter to the commander asserting the British claim to the area, as the fort was built in what the British claimed as the Ohio Territory. On his arrival, the commander of the fort declined to accept the letter, stating it should be addressed not to him, but to his commanding officer in Canada. Washington took the news back to Williamsburg that the French had refused to leave, and in March of 1754, Governor Robert Dinwiddie sent Washington back with new orders. He was to go to the location where the city of Pittsburgh now sits and start construction of a fort there to assure British control of the area. He was to, quote, act on the defensive, but in case any attempts are made to obstruct the works or interrupt our settlements by any persons whatsoever, you are to restrain such offenders, and in case of resistance to make prisoners of, or kill and destroy them. A small force had been sent ahead of Washington, led by a man by the name of William Trent, to begin construction of a stockade and storehouse in preparation. But they were forced to leave by a much larger French force, who began building Fort Duquesne. This was not known to Washington, as he gathered 186 paid volunteers and as many supplies as he was able to procure, setting off on April 2, 1754. When the French got news that Washington and his men were nearby, they sent 35 men to intercept and inform them that the area had been claimed by France. Trent's force found Washington first, updating them on the French forces in the area. Along with Trent were a group of Native Americans, the leader of whom Washington had traveled with before, and who themselves had grievances with the French over territorial disputes. Rather than turn back to report and regroup, Washington decided to start construction of a fort about 37 miles south of where the French were building Fort Duquesne and await further instructions. He named the fort Fort Necessity. His men also began construction of a road to allow them to eventually bring supplies and artillery to the area. On May 27th, Washington was informed there was a party of approximately 50 French Canadians nearby. He and his native allies located the French-Canadian camp, and Washington wrote in his diary, quote, we were advanced pretty near to them when they discovered us, whereupon I ordered the company to fire. Wagner's company received the whole fire of the French during the greatest part of the action, which only lasted a quarter of an hour before the enemy was routed. We killed Mr. de Monville, the commander, and 9 others. We wounded 1 and made 21 prisoners. After the battle, Washington was fully aware that the French would now have no choice but to attack. The hastily built fort was completed on June 3rd, and additional reinforcements arrived to bring the total number of his men to around 300, which should have included a higher-ranking officer to relieve him, but did not, as that officer had fallen from his horse and died along the way. The Native American that Washington had befriended tried to convince other native groups to ally with the British against the French, but had little success. Soon after, he and his men left the fort, likely knowing they were outnumbered. On June 28th, Washington pulled his men back from road construction to Fort Necessity, and on that same day, 600 French and 100 Native Americans allied with the French left Fort Duquesne, led by the brother of the commander killed in the earlier battle. Because of poor planning during the construction of the fort, the structure had insufficient cover from the rain, and the trenches that Washington's men had dug filled with water, turning them functionally into streams that soaked Washington's men. Also, because his men had been occupied with building the road, they had neglected to clear the area around the fort, giving the French attackers woods to hide in less than 100 yards from the fort, well within firing range. The French used the same road that Washington and his men had been building to approach, reportedly finding bodies of several French that had been left unburied along the way, further enraging the commander. When the French arrived on July 3rd, Washington's men were attempting to repair the mud-filled trenches. The French Canadians took full advantage of the failure to clear the woods, firing onto the fort from the cover. As rain fell that afternoon, Washington's gunpowder was soaked. The French commander, fearing reinforcements might be coming, offered to negotiate. Washington and his men would be allowed to leave and retreat, but would have to abandon the fort. Washington agreed, and marched his men all the way back to Williamsburg, where they reported what happened to Governor Dinwiddie, who expected to punish him. Instead, Dinwiddie praised him. While the official declarations would come later, many if not most historians agree that this was the start of the French and Indian War, which would last until 1763. Many historians also agree that this war was the primary cause for the British to call for an increase in the taxation of Americans to pay for it. And of course, these taxes were the leading grievance of those who started the outbreak of the American Revolution. The revolution, which General Washington was made commander-in-chief of in 1775, roughly 21 years after his expedition in Pennsylvania. Washington's colonial army, now allied with and supported by French troops under the command of General Comte de Rochambeau, surrounded the British at Yorktown, functionally ending the war. Peace negotiations dragged on until 1783, and already during this time, issues regarding financing the new country were emerging. While the war was raging in the middle of 1780, the Continental Congress promised Continental officers a lifetime pension of half of their pay once discharged. But in 1782, these payments were stopped as the new government built against excess taxation found itself with almost no revenue. In response, a group of officers, including General Henry Knox, wrote to Congress to correct the problem. The letter stated, quote, Any further experiments on their patients may have fatal effects. The Articles of Confederation did not give any mechanism for Congress to compel the states to fund the central government. Attempts to add an amendment to allow Congress to impose tariffs failed to pass in 1882, and the government could not procure loans without evidence of some future revenue to repay the loan. By 1783, the threats from the former officers in the Continental Army had grown as rumors of the finalization of the peace agreement, which was also lead to the disbanding of the military, increased the urgency while the Army was still an army, which could act, perhaps against Congress rather than for it. Washington met with the leaders of the Army and reportedly said to them they should oppose those, quote, who wickedly attempts to open the floodgates of civil discord and deluge our rising empire in blood. He brought with him a letter from Congress. Before reading it, he said, Gentlemen, you will permit me to put on my spectacles, for I have not only grown gray, but almost blind in the service of my country. The officers reportedly were calmed by Washington, who they knew and respected, and gave Congress additional time. Congress was able to issue bonds securing funding for 5 years of pension, but not the lifetime that had been promised. Disgruntled, but not to the point of mutiny, the Continental Army was for all intents and purposes disbanded, and the soldiers returned home, each with 3 months' pay, and only a small force remaining at West Point and some scattered troops along the frontier forts. But the dispersal was messy. On June 17, 1783, the Continental Congress in Philadelphia received a note from the Continental Army members stationed in the city, demanding the payments they had been promised. At first, the Congress ignored the threat, but then 2 days later got word that 80 soldiers had left their posts in Lancaster and joined those in Philadelphia, meaning there were around 500 soldiers in Philadelphia controlling the local munitions and arms depot, in alliance with the threat made in the letter. On June 20th, the building where Congress was meeting was mobbed by as many as 400 soldiers who blocked the exits. Alexander Hamilton was able to negotiate with the soldiers to convince them to let the delegates leave the building, and unsure if the local militia would aid them or join in the mutiny, the delegates fled to meet at Nassau Hall in New Jersey, temporarily moving the capital of the United States to the city of Princeton. George Washington had to send 1,500 men to suppress the protesters once Congress was safely out of the city. This event came to be known as the Pennsylvania Mutiny of 1783, and as a result, the capital of the new country was moved multiple times over the next few years, from Princeton to Annapolis later that year, then Trenton in 1884, and on to New York City in 1885. The veterans of the Continental Army who returned home without full pay often met with new debt and taxation. As one put it, quote, I have been greatly abused, have been obliged to do more than my part in the war, been loaded with class rates, town rates, province rates, continental rates, and all rates, been pulled and hauled by sheriffs, constables, and collectors, and had my cattle sold for less than they were worth. The great men are going to get all we have, and I think it's time for us to rise up and put a stop to it, and I have no more courts, nor sheriffs, nor collectors, nor lawyers. A man by the name of Daniel Shays had joined the militia in Massachusetts even before the Revolution had begun. He had reached the rank of sergeant as the battles of Lexington and Concord broke out in 1775. He personally fought in the Battle of Bunker Hill and rose to the rank of second lieutenant following citations for bravery. He eventually rose to the rank of captain, leading troops at the Battle of Saratoga. Shays was personally selected by George Washington to guard a captured British officer by the name of John Andre, who had collaborated with Benedict Arnold. Shays was likely the man who led Andre to the execution shortly before Shays left the army in 1780. When Shays returned home, he was summoned to the court to pay unpaid debts. He reported to the court he could not pay because he had not been paid in full for his military service, like so many others. He and other veterans petitioned the state government for relief and assistance, but when the state legislature adjourned without addressing the matter, on August 29, 1786, Shays joined with a group of protesters calling themselves the Regulators and shut down the courthouse in Northampton. The governor of Massachusetts was a man by the name of James Bowdoin. He condemned the protesters but did not immediately act. When about a week later the protesters shut down another courthouse in Worcester, the governor did call out the militia to respond, but the militia, sympathetic to the protesters, refused to help. When word got back to the governor that the protesters would again attempt to shut down another courthouse on September 26th, Governor Bowdoin had 300 militiamen waiting under the command of William Shepard in Springfield. Over the next 2 days, there was a kind of standoff, as court was postponed each day, and each side continued to recruit more men. By September 28th, Shepard had roughly 800 men, but the court still declined to hold hearings because of the protests. Hearing rumors the protesters might try to take the nearby armory, Shepard moved his men there. Throughout October, courts across the state were shut down by protesters, leading Massachusetts Speaker of the House John Warren to write to John Adams, quote, "We are now in a state of anarchy and confusion bordering on civil war." Revolutionary War hero Samuel Adams reportedly said of the protesters, quote, "The man who dares to rebel against the laws of the Republic ought to suffer death." Warrants were issued for the leaders of the protest. In response, protest leaders reportedly wrote, quote, "The seeds of war are now sown," and some spoke of destroying, quote, "the tyrannical government of Massachusetts." Eastern Massachusetts business leaders paid for a militia army to march west to end the uprising, sending about 3,000 men under the command of Benjamin Lincoln. Needing guns for the coming war, the rebels now did march on the armory at Springfield, and when the militia fired warning shots, they were ignored. So they unloaded grape shot into the protesters, killing 4 and wounding about 20. The protesters retreated and attempted to regroup, but this was, for all intents and purposes, the end of the uprising. As Lincoln's 3,000 men marched west, many of the leaders of the rebellion fled north into New Hampshire and Vermont. In the inquiry that followed, around 4,000 people signed confessions to participating in the protests in exchange for amnesty. Hundreds of others were indicted, but most were pardoned. Only 18 were convicted, and they were all sentenced to death, but only 2 were actually hanged: John Bly and Charles Rose, who were also accused of looting. Shay's role in the uprising is disputed, even as the event became to be known as Shay's Rebellion, but even he was pardoned in 1788. Thomas Jefferson is often cited of saying of Shay's Rebellion, quote, "The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. It is its natural manure." But what is often left out is that the Jefferson quote was written in 1787 while in Paris, far from the event, while living in a city where the French Revolution was only 2 years away. When the Revolution broke out in 1789, Jefferson wrote a less cited passage about the Constitution, which those who cite his view on the tree of liberty rarely mention. The quote was, "The question whether one generation of men has a right to bind another seems never to have been started either on this side or our side of the water. But between society and society, or generation and generation, there is no municipal obligation, no umpire but the law of nature. We seem not to have perceived that, by the laws of nature, one generation is to another one independent nation to another. On similar ground, it may be proved that no society can make a perpetual constitution, or even a perpetual law. The earth belongs always to the living generation. Every constitution then, and every law, naturally expires at the end of 19 years. If it be enforced longer, it is an act of force and not of right." George Washington, on the other hand, was in America and was elected president of the first Constitutional Convention. He wrote, quote, "You talk, my good sir, of employing influence to appease the present tumults in Massachusetts. I know not where that influence is to be found, or, if attainable, that it would be a proper remedy for the disorders. Influence is not government. Let us have a government by which our lives, liberties, and properties will be secured, or let us know the worst at once." After Shay's Rebellion, even Massachusetts, which was one of the states most opposed to federal power, had to concede that the Articles of Confederation were a failure. As John Jay put it, the inability to put down these rebellions made, quote, "the inefficiency of the federal government more and more manifest." From May 14th, 1787 to September 17th, delegates from every state other than Rhode Island met, initially to revise the Articles of Confederation, but eventually emerging with a new constitution. On September 12th, George Mason of Virginia proposed a Bill of Rights be added to add limits to the federal government, but the proposal was likely seen as a delaying tactic on Mason's part, as he had been in the opposition of the Constitution, and was one of only 3 delegates who declined to sign the final document, and so no such provision were added at that time. What was included in the Constitution was that the Founding Fathers' view on insurrection, specifically in Section 8, which outlined the powers of Congress, and said one of these powers was, quote, "to provide for the calling forth of the militia to execute the laws of the Union, suppress insurrections, and repel invasions." It was also stated in Section 9, listing powers not granted to Congress, quote, "the privilege of writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended unless, when in cases of rebellion or invasion, the public safety may require it." This vast expansion of the power of the federal government did raise some alarm bells, and the idea of a Bill of Rights to address these concerns was revisited. An anti-federalist, likely Robert Yates, wrote anonymously under the pseudonym Brutus. He wrote, quote, "Ought not a government, vested with such extensive and indefinite authority, to have been restricted by a Declaration of Rights? It certainly ought. So clear a point is this that I cannot help suspecting that those persons who attempt to persuade people that such reservations were less necessary under this Constitution than under those of the states are willfully endeavoring to deceive, and to lead you into absolute state of vassalage." Others were concerned that listing these rights might imply other rights did not exist. Alexander Hamilton wrote in response to call for a Bill of Rights, quote, "Bill of Rights are in their origin stipulations between kings and their subjects, abridgments of prerogative in favor of privilege, reservations of rights not surrendered to the prince. Such was the Magna Carta, obtained by the barons, sword in hand, from King John." Despite not having any Bill of Rights, 5 states, Delaware, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Georgia, and Connecticut, quickly ratified the new Constitution. The Massachusetts Convention did not go as smoothly. It included a fistfight between Francis Dana and Eldridge Gerry, but it did eventually pass with calls for amendments, which were later incorporated into the 5th and 10th Amendments. Virginia and New York similarly approved the Constitution with suggestions for amendments, and in the end, only North Carolina and Rhode Island held out for amendments to be finalized before ratification. Washington became president under the new Constitution in 1789 and said in his inaugural address regarding the writing of the eventual Bill of Rights, quote, "Whilst you carefully avoid every alteration which might endanger the benefits of a united and effective government, or which ought to await the future lessons of experience, a reverence for the characteristic rights of freemen and a regard for public harmony will sufficiently influence your deliberations on the question, how far the former can be impregnably fortified, or the latter be safely and advantageously promoted." For the Second Amendment specifically, Madison started from the English law passed in 1689, also called a Bill of Rights. This document is stated, quote, "Subjects, which are Protestants, may have arms for their defense suitable to conditions, and as allowed by law." The allowed by law is often misunderstood in discussions, as the intent was a restraint on the power of the king, not the government. It was not that the government could not order his enemies disarmed, but the king could not do so without the consent of Parliament, the representative of the people. Similar declarations had already been written into the Pennsylvania and Massachusetts Constitution, only rather than restricting the king, they focused more on fears of the standing army. Pennsylvania's law read, quote, "that the people have a right to bear arms for the defense of themselves and the state, and as a standing army in the time of peace are dangerous to liberty, they ought not be kept up, and that the military should be kept under strict subordination to and governed by the civil powers." Massachusetts law stated, quote, "The people have a right to keep and bear arms for the common defense, and as in times of peace armies are dangerous to liberty, they ought not to be maintained without the consent of the legislature, and the military power shall always be held in exact subordination to the civil authority and be governed by it." Again, both indicate civil power has the authority, just not the military absent the civil government's authority. All of these being concerned with the dangers of a standing army, something which was a concern not just in terms of king or dictator, but also recently demonstrated when the Continental Army nearly staged a coup. The concern over any kind of standing army, particularly a federal one, was echoed regularly in debates and discussions. Many feared a federal government with a standing army might attempt to disarm the states, especially the state militias. Madison wrote about this concern in the Federalist paper, stating, quote, "The only refuge left for those who prophesy the downfall of the state governments is the visionary supposition that the federal government may previously accumulate a military force for the projects of ambition." But he argued, quote, "The state governments, with the people on their side, would be able to repel the danger. The highest number to which, according to the best computation, a standing army can be carried in any country does not exceed 1/100th part of the whole number of souls, or 1/25th part number able to bear arms. This proportion would not yield the United States an army of more than 25 or 30,000 men." The Constitution itself had already provided some limits on the federal control of the militia by leaving the selection of officers under the control of the state. It stated, quote, "To provide for organizing, arming, and disciplining the militia, and for governing such part of them that may be employed by the service of the United States, reserving to the states respectively the appointment of officers and the authority of training the militia according to the discipline prescribed by Congress." But again, the state militias being run by officers of the state would be meaningless if the federal government could disarm the state militias. Additionally, in 1757, the English Parliament had passed, quote, "an act for better ordering of the militia forces in the several counties of that part of Great Britain called England, which included the phrase, 'A well-ordered and well-disciplined militia is essentially necessary for the safety, peace, and prosperity of this kingdom.'" Citing this act during the American Revolution, General Thomas Pickering and then Frederick von Steuben wrote field manuals for militia training and discipline. Von Steuben's Regulations for the Order and Discipline of the Troops of the United States became known as the Blue Book and was the official U.S. military training guide until 1812. In slave states, there were additional concerns regarding insurrection of another kind if their militia was called away or disarmed. Patrick Henry cited these concerns when he wrote, quote, "If the country be invaded, a state may go to war, but cannot suppress insurrections. If there happen to be an insurrection of slaves, the country cannot be invaded. They cannot therefore suppress it without the interposition of Congress. Congress and Congress only can call forth a militia." And this wasn't the only concern from slave owners. In 1776, Thomas Jefferson proposed for the Virginia Constitution a similar kind of amendment with the wording that stated, quote, "No freeman shall ever be debarred the use of arms within his own lands or tenements." It was rejected because that definition would allow free blacks to bear arms. And there were also concerns about forced conscription in these state militias for those who had religious objections. James Madison took all of these concerns into consideration when he wrote his first draft that stated, quote, "The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, a well-armed and well-regulated militia being the best security of a free country. But no person religiously scrupulous of bearing arms shall be compelled to render military service in person." When this first draft was taken to committee, it was modified to read, quote, A well-regulated militia, composed of the body of the people, being the best security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, but no person religiously scrupulous shall be compelled to bear arms. A comma was added the following day, and the religious exemption was removed, making it a well-regulated militia, being the best security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, and then it went to the Senate for approval. In the Senate, after debate, the words, "for the common defense," after bear arms was proposed, but defeated. Other small modifications were voted on by the Senate, making it a well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the free people to bear arms shall not be infringed. On September 21st, 1789, the final version was voted on. It reads, "A well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed." It was then sent out to the states along with the 9 other amendments in what we now call the Bill of Rights. It was not ratified until December 15th, 1791. A month prior to the ratification, however, the plan of militias being able to be a viable replacement for a federal standing army ran into some harsh realities. As part of the Treaty of Paris, the English had granted the United States more or less all of the land east of the Mississippi River. But of course the Native Americans who never agreed to this treaty disagreed, and had themselves come together in what came to be known as the Northwest Confederation to stand up against the incursion. In 1790, Washington sent a force of over 1,400 men, mostly militia, to build a fort in the area that is now Cincinnati in order to secure the area. While they were able to build the fort, which they named Fort Washington, they suffered over 200 casualties while unsuccessfully trying to secure the area around the fort. Washington petitioned Congress for more men and was given a 6-month allocation to raise 2,000 men. But the short term meant the vast majority were lightly trained, ill-equipped militiamen rather than fully trained soldiers. In the evening of November 2nd, 1791, a group of around 920 soldiers, along with around 200 or so other camp support, were led by the governor of the Northwest Territory, Arthur Sinclair. They were camped on a hill near Fort Recovery, Ohio. Some reports indicated desertions by the militia had been an issue, and the defensive layout seemed to consider more keeping soldiers from fleeing than actively defending the camp. Despite all of the earlier challenges and setbacks, Sinclair seemed confident that he could accomplish the mission, writing to Washington, quote, "Savages, if violently attacked, will always break and give way, and once broke, for the want of discipline, will never rally." Sinclair's camp was surrounded overnight by Native American warriors, who attacked it in ambush at dawn. Sinclair would later write, "In a few minutes, our whole camp, which extended above 300 yards in length, was entirely surrounded and attacked on all quarters." Reports in the battle indicated the militia almost immediately fled, finding themselves chased down from behind. Some of the more experienced soldiers did make a stand, but after a few hours they were also forced into a disorganized retreat. When the battle was over, there were over 332 Americans killed, which was more than 2/3 of the American soldiers in the camp and about a quarter of the entire fledgling United States Army at the time. Only 24 soldiers were able to escape unharmed. On the other side, estimates were only that about 21 Native Americans were killed and about 60 or so wounded. Washington went to Congress asking for military spending, writing, quote, "We are involved in actual war." Congress agreed to allow Washington to set up a small standing army that became known as the Legion of the United States, which would have a 3-year enlistment and increase in soldiers' pay for those in the Legion. But Congress still had concerns about any shift to any kind of large standing federal army, rather than a citizen militia of each state remaining the core of the military. So in May of 1792, Congress passed, quote, "An act more efficiently to provide for the national defense by establishing a uniform militia throughout the United States." This act required, quote, "each and every free able-bodied white male citizen of the respective states, residents therein, who is or shall be of age 18 years, and under the age of 45, except as hereinafter accepted, shall severally and respectively be enrolled in the militia. Every citizen so enrolled and notified shall, within 6 months hereafter, provide himself with a good musket or firelock, a sufficient bayonet and belt, 2 spare flints, and a knapsack and a pouch with a box therein to contain not less than 24 cartridges, suited to the bore of his musket or firelock. Each cartridge to contain proper quantities of powder and ball, or with a good rifle, knapsack and shot punch and powder horn, 20 balls suited to the bore of the rifle, and 1/4 pound of powder, and shall appear so armed, accoutred, and provided, when called out to exercise or into service, except that when called on company days to do exercise only, he may appear without a knapsack." It also included regulations on gun manufacturers, quote, "that from after 5 years from the passing of this act, muskets for arming the militia are herein required shall be of bore sufficient balls for the 18th part of a pound." The law included a long list of exemptions, and most agree that they were inconsistently enforced. But these, as they were passed as less than a year after the Second Amendment was ratified, and were presumably seen as consistent with the intent of the terms of militia, were designed to have a force able to be called on by the state and federal government without the expense or risk of a coup from a federal standing army. At the end of 1791, likely in part to fund things like the Northwest Territory Campaign, the federal government used the new power granted by the Constitution to levy taxes to begin paying down Revolutionary War debt. Attempting to use taxation also to address vice, a tax on distilled spirits was proposed and passed as the very first tax on domestic products. It was known as the whiskey tax. This tax was particularly unpopular in western Pennsylvania, where not only was whiskey a popular drink, but many farmers used stills as secondary income sources, and even as payment for work during shortages of currency at the time. The tax also hit small-scale stills harder than larger-scale operations in the East, as it allowed a flat fee per still, or a tax per gallon, meaning large stills paying a flat rate generally paid less than the gallon rate. Western Pennsylvania also felt neglected by the federal government relative to those larger cities in the East around protection on the expanding frontiers in conflicts with Native Americans. When petitions to their representatives failed to make any change, the protests became violent. On September 11, 1791, a tax collector named Robert Johnson was tarred and feathered. When an official was sent to serve arrest warrants on Johnson's attackers, he also was tarred and feathered, and the taxes went uncollected for much of 1791 and 1792 in that area. In August of 1792, a convention was held to protest the tax, raising liberty poles. They took control of the local militias and issued demands around the repeal of the tax, as well as debt collection and foreclosure generally. President Washington signed a proclamation condemning the resistance, which was widely published on September 15, 1792. But this condemnation changed little. Through 1793, whiskey protests continued to spread throughout Appalachia. Men broke into the homes of a tax collector in Fayette County and forced him to agree to stop collection at gunpoint. In May of 1794, a federal district attorney issued subpoenas to 60 distilleries for non-payment, further increasing tensions. Federal marshals accompanied tax inspectors for western Pennsylvania as they were delivering the writs. While they did, General John Neville was fired on around 10 miles from Pittsburgh. The marshals fled to Pittsburgh, while Neville returned to his fortified home nearby. The home was surrounded by 30 anti-whiskey tax militiamen who believed Marshall and the writs were inside, demanded both. Neville shot one of the militiamen who retreated to gather reinforcements, and they returned with nearly 600 men the following day. Neville also called out for reinforcements, but all that came were 10 soldiers from Pittsburgh. The soldiers did what they could to fortify Neville's home, and had Neville hide in a ravine nearby before the rebels arrived. Women and children were allowed to leave before a firefight ensued. Some reports indicate a white flag was raised from the home, leading the rebel leader to step into the open, where he was shot and mortally wounded. Following this, the rebels set fire to the home and drove off the soldiers, one of whom may have died from his wounds, along with 2 to 3 militiamen. The whiskey rebels became more emboldened as their numbers grew. On August 1st, an estimated 7,000 men gathered at Braddock Field outside of Pittsburgh to organize and march on the city. Some of the more radical members of the group gave speeches threatening to burn down the homes of the rich. A rebel leader by the name of David Bradford reportedly called for the guillotine to be brought to America, comparing himself to Robespierre. Likely he was not aware that Robespierre had himself been killed by a guillotine just a few days prior on July 28th as the terror in France turned on itself. In the end, the leaders of Pittsburgh were able to convince the marchers that Pittsburgh was not to blame and expelled some in their town who had written letters showing they were opposed to the rebels. With the exception of the burning down of some barns owned by federal officers, the march was largely peaceful. But the unrest wasn't just in Pennsylvania. In August of 1794, another tax collector's home in what is now Morgantown, West Virginia, was surrounded. One newspaper account of the event wrote, quote, "The insurgents have been quite outrageous, and done much mischief. Here we have been quiet until a few days ago, when about 30 men, blacked, came in the night of the 9th instant, and surrounded the house of the collector of this county. But the man's escaping and advertising that he had office, they went off peacefully." On August 7th, George Washington announced with, quote, "the deepest regret," that the federal government would call out the militia to put down the rebellion, and gave a deadline to the rebels of September 1st. Washington allowed negotiators additional time, until the negotiators wrote back to Washington on September 24th that it was, quote, "necessary that the civil authority should be aided by military force in order to secure a due execution of laws." Washington used the Militia Act that had passed 2 years prior, and less than a year after the ratification of the Second Amendment, to raise a militia of around 12,500 men to put down the uprising. Few volunteered, so a draft was ordered, and the draft was not popular. Liberty poles were raised near many recruitment sites, and in Hagerstown, Maryland, 800 troops had to be sent to put down a draft riot, leading to around 150 arrests. When a liberty pole was raised on September 11, 1794, in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, the pole raisers were surrounded by federal officials, leading to 2 civilian deaths. But George Washington was undeterred. He left Philadelphia, the capital at that time, to personally lead the forces. The rebellion collapsed even before the forces arrived in October of that year. Many, if not most, fled to the mountains to go into hiding. On November 13th, the military executed a series of raids in the area, and 150 men were arrested, most in the middle of the night, and often forced to march barefoot in their sleeping clothes to be interrogated. While there were a number of state prosecutions for assault and rioting, 24 of the ringleaders were federally indicted for high treason, but most were able to avoid capture. Of the 10 who were put on trial, only 2 were convicted, and both were later pardoned by Washington. Washington explained his actions and his reasoning in a State of the Union address, stating, quote, "The misled have abandoned their errors, and pay the respect to our Constitution and laws, which is due from good citizens to the public authorities of the society. These circumstances have induced me to pardon generally the offenders here referred to, and to extend forgiveness to those who have been adjudged to capital punishment. For I shall always think it a sacred duty to exercise with firmness and energy the constitutional powers with which I am vested. Yet it appears to me no less consistent with the public good than it is my personal feelings to mingle in the operations of government every degree of moderation and tenderness, which the national justice, dignity, and safety may permit." Even with military action, the whiskey tax was still not consistently paid. Over the next 6 years, around 175 distillers in Kentucky alone were convicted for violations of the law. By 1802, the law and other internal taxes were repealed, leaving only tariffs to fund the federal government. This was until 1812, when the United States declared war on Britain. At the Battle of Bladensburg in 1814, British troops soundly defeated the combined forces of Maryland and Virginia militias. President James Madison, the same person who wrote the original draft of the Second Amendment, and who wrote Federalist papers arguing militias could replace the need for a federal standing army, was now a witness to militia in action against the standing British army. After watching the battle and the aftermath, Madison said, quote, "I could never have believed so great a difference existed between regular troops and a militia force if I had not witnessed the scenes of this day." The British forces continued on to capture Washington, D.C., and burn much of it to the ground. With the burning of the Capitol, the argument that a citizen militia could be a viable replacement for a standing federal army more or less ended. In March of 1815, Congress nearly doubled the peacetime level of the regular army to 10,000 men, and most state and local militia in the Northeast were more social clubs which assisted with law enforcement services. In the South, militia service was more regular than expected, mostly for slave patrols to locate escaped slaves, but these militias were not particularly well organized. An 1840 account from Mississippi wrote, "The company musters of the citizen soldiers were held 4 times a year. After a brief parade consisted in a blundering execution of unwarlike antics, these men would start drinking, and usually several fights occurred." In 1842, Associate Judge of the Supreme Court Joseph Story wrote about this decline with concern, saying, quote, "And yet, though this truth would seem so clear, and the importance of a well-regulated militia would seem so undeniable, it cannot be disguised that among the American people there is a growing indifference to any system of militia discipline, and a strong disposition, from a sense of its burdens, to be rid of all regulations. How is it practicable to keep the people's duty armed without some organization? It is difficult to see. There is certainly no small danger that indifference may lead to disgust, and disgust to contempt, and thus gradually undermine all the protections intended by this clause of our National Bill of Rights. Following the Civil War, many blacks formed militias to protect themselves, but following the Colfax massacre, the Supreme Court stated in 1876 in United States v. Cruikshank, quote, "The right there specified is that of bearing arms for a lawful purpose. This is not a right granted by the Constitution. Neither is it in any manner dependent upon that instrument for its existence. The Second Amendment declares that it shall not be infringed, but this, as has been seen, means no more than it shall not be infringed by Congress. This is one of the amendments that has no other effect than to restrict the powers of the national government." In 1903, Congress passed the Efficiency in Militia Act. This reorganized the state militias by creating what we now know as the National Guard. States would be able to receive federal funding in exchange for sending Guard officers to federal training schools and having their members meet basic training requirements, all provided by federal trainers. This act also reiterated that the conscription law, which Washington used during the Whiskey Rebellion, remained in effect, but that the groups would now be divided into the organized militia, consisting of the National Guard, and the, quote, unorganized or reserve militia. In 1918, during World War I, the Supreme Court affirmed unanimously the constitutionality of conscription, stating, quote, it may not be doubted that the very conception of a just government and its duty to the citizens includes the reciprocal obligation of the citizen to render military service in case of need, and the right to compel it. To do more than state the proposition is absolutely unnecessary in view of the practical illustration afforded by almost universal legislation to that effect now in force. To this day, all American men are required to register to be eligible for the draft at the age of 18 through selective service. Failure to do so is a felony punishable by a fine of up to $250,000 and or 5 years of imprisonment. History is awkward.